He was declared dead in battle, until someone knocked on the door years later. What follows is a dramatized composite vignette inspired by real events from December 1944. The soldier at the center of this story is not a single historical person, but a created figure whose experience gathers fragments of testimony, maps, and reports, a human lens through which we see how pipelines, jerry cans, and the smell of benzene determine the fate of men and campaigns. December 17, 1944. Before dawn, the air in the Ardennes felt like the inside of an ice chest. Frost made the hedgerows glitter. Breath hung in front of men's faces as if caught on invisible wire. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. A tiger tank crouched under the skeletal limbs of a beech tree, metal skin dull with frost, its turret turned toward a slope where, a day earlier, snow had been churned into ruts by armored tracks. The engine coughed once, a tired sound that had already become a bad joke, and then it went silent. Lieutenant Lucas Brandt, again a figure stitched from several accounts, stood with his palms pressed into his pockets, cheeks stinging in the cold. He listened to the silence that followed the engine. Around him, men fiddled with controls, tapped dials, and cursed under their breath at a gauge that stubbornly read empty. The vehicles had been burning any spare fuel for heat all night. Some drivers admitted to siphoning what they could into flasks to warm their hands. That morning, the truth landed in a way no sunbeam could warm. The tank's tank, like so many others in the spearhead, was empty. Across the field, the road was a long snake of rubber tracks, stalled half in the lanes, half in the ditch, vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel rather than for battle damage. Men sat on running boards, hunched over cigarette butts, staring at the horizon as if a miracle might arrive with the dawn. The offensive that had begun 2 days earlier on December 16 had been planned with urgency and a brutal arithmetic. Speed and surprise would carry the German spearhead into the Allied rear, seize bridges, and split armies. What the plan had not counted on was the simplest of commodities, fuel. The day before, a patrol had reported a clearing with drums and stacks of jerry cans. News traveled like wildfire across the frozen landscape. There were tales, some true, some embroidered in the cold, about entire American dumps left behind by hurried convoys. Rows and rows of metal bottles, gullies filled with crates, a small sea of fuel beneath a ragged canvas. For men who had been rationing oil like a family counts bread at the end of a long winter, the rumors sounded like salvation. When Brandt's unit arrived just after first light, the reality was almost anticlimactic. It was not a single dump, but a scatter of supply points, a ruined farmhouse with its cellar full of tins, an orchard dotted with drums, a small railway siding where crates lay half open.
The air carried a sharp chemical tang, benzene and diesel, and it dissolved the numbness into something like religious awe. Soldiers moved among the stacks reverently, counting and uncapping, pouring into canteens, into tins, into any hollow that could hold life. They found roughly 50,000 gallons in that first discovery, a figure that would be carved into after-action reports and oral recollections in different tongues. For men who had watched fuel trickle into tanks like contraband, 50,000 gallons was not only money, but the idea of mobility returned. For a few hours, the front line resembled a religious procession. Mechanics lit little fires to solder lids, cooks brewed coffee on new fuel. The commander, a young officer who smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and authority, let himself feel the distant warmth of relief. But relief is a thin thing in war when weighed against logistics. The German army was not only short of petrol because of misfortune that morning. Months of Allied strategic bombing had taken a toll on the synthetic fuel plants that kept Germany's war machine moving. The Reich synthetic program, already overburdened, had been hammered by raids that cut production and made every liter a prize. Meanwhile, the Americans had built an entire apparatus to move oil to the front, tankers, pipelines beneath the channel, PLUTO, and an endless rhythm of trucks known as the Red Ball Express that turned American industrial abundance into the daily bread of armies rolling east. Brandt learned, as any curious officer would, that capture was one thing, holding was another. Papers picked up in a ransacked command car suggested that the Americans had been able to move staggering quantities. The lines in an officer's notebook, smudged with frostbite and soot, showed routes and dates. convoys that left Normandy carrying hundreds of tons a day, pipeline spools that, in the imagination of a desperate man, ran like veins beneath the ocean. The arithmetic was unforgiving. For every liter found in a smashed farmhouse, an American force could move thousands of gallons through a pipeline in a single night if it chose to. Even as Brandt's men celebrated what they believed would staunch the immediate bleeding of the offensive, other reports came in to complicate the story. Far to the north, at Stavelot, and in the area the Americans called Stavelot, flames painted the sky black. Engineers in Allied uniform had not merely evacuated warehouse shelves, they had set fire to them. The columns of smoke rose and held like a physical rebuke. They were burning what they had so prodigiously produced. It was a deliberate, cold calculus, destroy to deny, and for Brandt and others who had pinned their hopes on the capture of foreign fuel, it was a revelation that felt obscene. How could burning your own lifeblood be a sign of strength? The answer lay in numbers and in confidence.
The Allied commanders could afford to torch reserves because they had access to alternate, secure lines of supply. Miles of pipeline laid under the channel, the ceaseless wheels of the Red Ball trucks, the industrial hinterland back in North America that poured out gasoline like a river. Their ability to destroy millions of gallons without blinking told German soldiers more than anyone could say. Scarcity was not a temporary misfortune. It was a strategic condition baked by production and protected by logistics. Back in Brandt's pocket, the captured manifest showed small notations, dates stamped December 15 and 16, routes that ran from the coast inland, and a notation that made any trained eye pause. The Americans were not running on hope, they were running on systems. For Germany, the synthetic plants had once seemed like a miracle, a way to substitute coal chemistry for lacking oil fields. But the miracle had its limits. Allied bombers had learned where those plants lived. The plants had been vulnerable, concentrated, and once silenced, difficult to replace. This cold arithmetic moved through the company like a disease. Men who had been buoyed by the scent of diesel in their cuffs now felt an unnameable pressure behind their eyes. The campaign's momentum depended on seizing and exploiting supplies. Yet each time they found something useful, a larger, more bitter reality revealed itself. The resources poured out by Allied industry could be destroyed without imperiling the front, while German stocks remained finite and fragile. It is important here to step back and name not only the smell of oil and the clanking of vehicles, but the scale of what logistics meant in 1944. The Allies, by that winter, had a production capacity and an organizational reach unmatched in history to that point. The Red Ball Express would, in its frantic months of operation, move tens of thousands of tons a day, keeping frontline units fed, clothed, and mobile. Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, was an engineering answer to the problem of conveyance. It made possible the movement of oil independent of vulnerable convoy routes. These were not abstractions. For the German soldier in the field, they were the difference between an engine that turned and one that stilled. Brandt and his officers put together the scattered evidence with the urgency of men constructing a map while walking across it. Intercepts, captured documents, a smattering of English-language newspapers found in the pockets of dead GIs, all confirmed an uncomfortable calculus. The Allies could throw away supplies and still keep moving. In Brandt's mind, the small triumph of Hansfeld began to look less like a turning point and more like a cruel joke. Stories and small, telling details traveled back and forth among the units like contraband themselves. A sergeant swore that he had been given a coffee by a young American soldier who had shrugged and said something in a voice rough with fatigue, but almost cheerful. "We have plenty." Soon after, in the distance where the Stavelot inferno painted the sky the color of pitch, the meaning of that cheer became gruesomely literal. Men watched as a stockpile of fuel burned for 3 days, a black column that could be seen for miles around. For every man whose eyes widened at the sight, there was another who felt a hollow twist in his stomach. The Allies were not burning fuel because they had lost it. They were burning fuel because they had such abundance that denying it to the enemy made strategic sense. That night, Brandt crawled into his sleeping bag in an empty barn with the others, the wood beneath him creaking like a tired ship. The farm smelled of animal and old bread.
It was an ordinary place that had been pulled into history for a moment. In the dark, someone laughed bitterly and told the joke that had been running through the lines all day, that the war had been reduced from deeds of glory to the counting of cans. The laugh was a half plea. The men were trying to hold on to something like meaning. The next morning brought news of another kind of arithmetic. German intelligence and captured maps hinted at larger American logistics facilities further east and north, places where entire convoys congregated and where pipeline junctions collected fuel like small reservoirs. These maps suggested that the 50,000 gallons found at Hansfeld could be a drop in a sea of resources beyond their reach. The realization gnawed at officers who had tried to balance ambition with reality. To make war, you must first be able to move. If your opponents can move faster and in greater volume, then every tactical victory becomes provisional. On December 18th and 19th, the spearhead's momentum showed the strain. Columns kinked and stalled. Recon units reported tanks abandoned because their engines had gone silent from lack of petrol, not from hits. Medical detachments found themselves compromised by the same scarcity. Ambulances that could not be fueled. Wounded men left in the open until someone could get the vehicle cranked. The Malmedy massacre, a blot on what some hoped would remain a pure picture of military maneuver, had already shown how brutality existed alongside logistics. Moral transgressions and mechanical failures both fed the same grim ledger of human suffering. There was no clean line between atrocity and necessity. Both had consequences for lives and for memory. Among Brandt's men, the mood shifted from the fever of advance to the hard, slow calculations of survival. Discussions in the officer tent turned to rationing protocols that read like mathematics. How many kilometers could a Tiger travel with a reduced load? Could columns be rerouted to capture fuel dumps without inviting encirclement?
Lines of communication shortened into something almost primitive. Which truck could be spared? Which vehicle could be cannibalized for parts to keep one engine alive? The romantic idea of war, of decisive charges and honor, thinned under the weight of inventory sheets and fuel gauges. Then came the moment that, in the ledger of the campaign, would hinge the sense of everything. While Brandt's squad performed a cautious sweep through a half-ruined village outside of Stavelot, a detachment returned with a report that did something strange to the men's faces. They had found a depot, a place where barrels lay in rows, and the earth around them bore tracks. But the site had been systematically rendered useless. Tanks knocked in, drums punctured, and an entire inventory burned in long, hot columns. The smell of smoke crept into their clothes like an accusation. Someone put it plainly. The Allies had chosen to destroy what they could not carry. To the soldiers on the ground, that choice read like a humiliation. Here, at least, a resource existed only to be turned to ash. Brandt stood at the edge of the smoldering field and watched the black towers of smoke rise. For a moment he thought of his childhood, of a railway station at dawn, smelling of oil and coal, of men with maps and watches. War, he realized with a clarity that hurt, was now decided less by the courage of men in the moment than by the capacity of factories and the decisions of engineers half a continent away. A man could be brave until his gauge read empty. Bravery did not create fuel. Back at the regimental planning table, the commander unfolded a captured distribution schedule. It showed not only where fuel had been, but how predictable its movement had become. Conveyor belts of supply, constant and vast. The Allies had not only ships and pipelines, they had the men to drive the trucks at night across mud and snow, mechanics who could keep their engines running, a civilian industry that had been turned into a military bloodstream. The German model had been clever and industrious, but it had been brittle. Strategic bombing had turned refineries into rubble. The synthetic plants could not scale quickly enough. There is no shame in stating the obvious. Economics had joined the battlefield, and it was a ruthless partner. In the fields, the men argued like any group of weather-beaten humans, blaming fortune, cursing command, whispering that perhaps the next day would bring supply. But by the time December 20 arrived, sentiment had curdled into something like resignation. The offensive faltered. Tanks that should have pushed forward were left with hatches open in the snow, crews gone when the German lines drew thin and desperate. Some of the vehicles were scabbed together with ingenuity. One commander made a scavenged rig limp by using two engines from different models, linked by belts and prayers. It worked, briefly, and then did not.
In the end, machinery is not poetry. It obeys the laws of metal and oil. Casualties rose not only from bullets, but from being stranded. Men who might have been evacuated in a well-fueled ambulance were left to the weather. In villages, civilians suffered. The war's great engines so often turned around the most ordinary of people: housewives who found their cellars stripped of coal, shopkeepers whose stores had been emptied, children who learned the smell of smoke as part of their daily horizon. In the supply centers that burned, animals and stores went up in flames. The scene at Stavelot was not an abstract loss. It was families, livestock, and the town's life rendered into black columns. Yet, there were small, stubborn pockets of human behavior that refused to be folded entirely into arithmetic. A sergeant, half drunk on hope, insisted on filling a thermos and steaming it over a tiny fire to hand a cup of coffee to a frozen comrade. Two drivers, who had been enemies in another life, traded last cigarettes. In camps and barns, men told the stories that the cold could not swallow, of mothers in towns back home, of harvests that had been stolen by war, of small blessings. These little acts are what made the difference between a statistic and a man. By December 21st, the German High Command was forced into difficult decisions. Field Marshal Walter Model, spoken of in grim tones, and others watched the campaign's seams split under strain. The offensive required mobility and reserves. Both were dwindling. The strategist in every unit tried to weigh risk: push forward and risk encirclement, or pull back and concede ground that had been bought in blood and cold. For Brandt's unit, the choice was personal as well as strategic. Men counted the state of their ammunition, the health of their engines, and the number of soldiers whose boots had holes through which the snow found skin. It is here that records become more human and less archival. Diaries taken by survivors years later describe how, in the face of systemic collapse, men made choices that were at once mundane and monumental. A mechanic deciding which tank to steal a fuel line from, an orderly kneeling to cover the eyes of a dying comrade, a young officer forging a pass that might save a man's life. The war reduced to inventory lists is monstrous, but the people inside the lists still chose, loved, and protected one another as they could. Then came a small, almost ridiculous event that would have consequences beyond the immediate. A stray American reconnaissance unit stumbled across a column where a few captured jerry cans sat stacked next to a ruined radio. The soldiers, exhausted and aware of the larger inferno that their supply decisions had created, shrugged and moved on. But the fact that these supplies were inescapably present on one map and purposely incinerated on another map was what made the campaign feel like a theater of contradictions.
For Brandt and his men, such moments accumulated into a growing suspicion that they were being outmatched not just in weapons, but in an industrial tempo they could not match. As the offensive began to fray into pockets of fierce resistance and long, cold retreats, the grim truth set in. German tanks were being abandoned not because they had been pierced by shells, but because they sat idle, their gaskets dry. The field maintenance crews, always the unsung backbone of any mechanized army, were working miracles on less and less. Often they could make a vehicle move only by stripping another until it was nothing more than an empty hull, a ghost of metal on a frozen ditch. Between December 22 and 24, the temperature dropped still further, and the strain on the human body multiplied. Frostbite, hypothermia, and hunger made the usual wounds worse. In this geometry of suffering, the Americans, with their pipelines and their unstoppable logistics, were not immune to hardship, but they could replace losses more easily. That difference mattered. The Allies did not always fight battles with the luxury of abundance in mind, but their industrial base let them accept certain losses as manageable. The German side, however valiant or cunning, could not convert scarcity into sustainability. Brandt watched the lines thin. Men he knew, cooks, drivers, officers, disappeared into the sideways weather. Some were captured in the confusion of retreat. Others simply vanished into the snows. Their names later entered onto rosters as missing, presumed dead. The phrase "declared dead" came to have a bureaucratic finality that felt cruel to the living. To be declared dead was to be folded into a ledger, an act that could precede the truth by years. It is at this fracture between military ledger and human life that our dramatized composite story moves toward the hinge promised at the beginning, the knock on the door. For now, however, the narrative remains in the December of war. Tanks with empty gauges, the smell of burned fuel in the cold air, the realization that industrial might, pipelines, convoys, factories, had become the decisive instrument of success. Men who expected to find salvation in captured cans instead found charred fields, and the knowledge that their adversary could afford to burn what they, in their scarcity, could only covet. On December 24, as news of the offensive stalling filtered up the chain of command, a small group of Brandt's comrades tried to perform one last act of defiance. They planned to push towards a crossroads where reports suggested a fuel transfer might be temporarily vulnerable. The plan was not grandiose, merely a targeted raid to seize supplies. Perhaps there is in every soldier a ledger of hope that cannot be entirely erased, the belief that one more act, one more effort, might change the arithmetic. They moved under a sky thick with cloud and the heavy musk of smoke from distant fires.
They took the crossroads at dawn, an operation of inches and shivering courage. For a fleeting hour, it seemed as if fate might relent. They found barrels, not the mountains they had imagined, but enough to set a small flame of possibility in the commanders' faces. The men loaded what they could into carts and tanks. The convoy, a patched, creeping thing, rolled back toward the lines, and for a while the thought of being able to move again warmed their speech. But war's arithmetic is relentless. The convoy encountered a choke point, a bridge that had been sabotaged and hastily repaired, a bottleneck where other units were already stalled. Trucks jostled, motors idled, and in the chaos, a shell ripped through a fuel-laden truck. The blast was not cinematic in any romantic way. It was sudden, filthy, and banal. Men shouted, some were maimed, a cart of supplies became a smoking ruin. The small hope died on impact, and with it the illusion that a single bravely won raid could counteract the larger systems arrayed against them. Brandt watched his men stumble among the wreckage, faces split with exhaustion and a kind of disbelief. That night, as he sat in a ruined farmhouse and lit a cigarette, he could not help to think of the bridge, not just of steel, but of systems that had been crossed and then demolished. The war had been transformed from a contest of courage into a management of flows, oil, men, spare parts, telegrams. The bridge had become a metaphor for the small things that made the difference between withdrawal and advance. And yet, even amid the despair, human stories persisted. A corporal who had been declared dead by a neighboring unit after being separated in the chaos had been found at a farmhouse 2 days later, frostbitten and near collapse. He told a story that seemed almost like a parable, that he had crawled for miles, eaten stale bread from strangers' houses, and finally collapsed behind a shutter, where by accident a woman, a stranger, found him and fed him hot water and a slice of bread. Such small mercies scattered through the winter were what allowed some men to return to the ledger of the living. It is those small mercies, those private rescues, that prepare us for the door knock years later, a human punctuation to a story otherwise told by numbers and black smoke. The knock itself, when it comes in the dramatized scene that waits for us, will carry the entire weight of these months, the emptiness of tanks, the burned depots, the frozen fields, and the arithmetic that decided who would live and who would be, for a time, recorded as dead. But this is December still. The offensive's initial burst had run its course. Logistics, pipelines under the sea, nightly convoys, factories far from the battlefield had shown their power. Even when the Allies burned their own fuel, they did so from a place of abundance. The act of burning was not desperation, but strategy.
For the German units in the Ardennes, the knowledge that the enemy could destroy what they had built was an existential sting. Men like Brandt began to understand that romantic ideas of decisive action were often fantasies in a world where the prize was measured in gallons and miles of pipeline.
We leave them here on the edge of retreat, in the frost and smoke, with the taste of diesel in their mouths and the memory of black columns rising where supplies once lay. The human stories, the kindnesses, the betrayals, the private bargains struck between survival and honor, continue to weave through the cold. In time, some of those stories will reach quiet doorways and kitchens, and the ledger that once declared some men dead will be challenged by a simple knock on a neighbor's wood. For now, the war speaks in numbers and in the small, stubborn acts of men trying to keep engines running. The next movements will show how systems and people collide. More raids, more burned depots, the slow calculus of retreat. The map of December 1944 is already changing under their boots, and where one road narrows, another opens, sometimes to relief, sometimes to annihilation. The question becomes, for those who survive, not only how they came through, but what happens when the ledger is reopened and someone who had been counted among the lost steps back into a life that has moved on without him. They pulled back in pieces. The spearhead that had sped forward like a rumor now unraveled in snow and silence. Orders arrived as fragments. Hold the bridge, cover the flank, withdraw to the next hedgerow. The maps, once lines of confident ink, became lists of holes. Men who had set out with a clean idea of duty found themselves improvising survival routines instead. Siphon from one tank to give another a few kilometers. Disassemble a generator to keep a radio alive for a transmission that might never be answered. Trade the last dry blanket for a handful of boiled potatoes. Lucas Brandt's last clear memory of the front that winter was a sequence of small failures. The right track on his Tiger had been scored by ice and stone until a suspension arm sheared. A fuel line had been punctured in a scurry to move. A driver, a friend named Otto, had cursed and bled quietly under a tarpaulin because there had been no medic within reach. The tank that had been a refuge became a sliver of metal cold enough to bite fingers. When they abandoned the vehicle, not because an enemy round had turned the turret into a tomb, but because the engine would not turn and the crew had no way to tow it, Brandt marked the moment with the one small, absurd action he could. He took from the driver's pocket a faded photograph of a woman and a child and tucked it into his inner coat as if that scrap of paper might be a passport to another world.
The chaos after Stavelot and Hansfeld was not only the kind that gets written into operational reports, it was the level of bureaucratic anomie that makes names disappear. Units split and recombined. Men left in one place with orders to rejoin at another found the rallying point already gone. Lists were miscopied, rosters burned with huts, and the one constant, fuel, was the thing that turned the living into entries on a sheet. When Brandt and a small handful of his crew tried to make their way back to a collection point that evening, they were swept into the tide of retreat. Snow hid tracks, a fading sun rendered hedgerows into the same flat gray as the fields. They stumbled into a small town where the whole street smelled of burned wood, and the air tasted like the ashes of a village. It was there, in the disarray of houses with missing windows and children who stared too long at uniforms, that Brandt's group encountered American soldiers. Not in a grand surrender, but in the tired, practical way of men who have been on the road too long. A farmhouse where a half-dozen GIs had stopped to smoke and warm their hands. Brandt watched them at first, the camouflage a different cut, their breath clouding like small gray ghosts. He noticed simple things, the way an American adjusted the strap of his pack, the booted feet scuffed by miles of road, the quick gesture of a man who tossed half a loaf of bread to a dog. There was no theater in it. There was only fatigue and the business of moving. They were taken not as conquerors but as prisoners, by the process of registration and tags and fences. An interpreter barked questions. Names were written down. Brandt said his name aloud 3 times, because the act felt like an affirmation more than a record. He watched the American clerk fill a form with a pen that made an almost cheerful scratch on cheap paper. There was, even in that moment, a curious lack of ceremony, a mechanical admitting into the long list of casualties and captives that war demands. Brandt did not think at first that he would vanish into paper. He thought instead of the photograph in his coat, and of how cold the metal was against his spine. The Americans treated prisoners according to the Geneva rules they claimed to observe. Basic shelter, food, and a sorting system that would, if all went well, return those men to civilian life once combat operations ended. For a number of the men from Brandt's unit, that is what happened. Interrogations, camp stamps, a slow movement through the machinery of captivity, then release. But for others, the outcome was ambiguity.
The chaos of the Ardennes meant records lagged. A name misread, a man listed in the wrong column, and the ledger declared what it needed to declare. Someone in Brandt's former company, writing under the stress and frost of December, put his name on a short list of men, missing, presumed dead.
The entry was a small, clinical thing. A date, a last known location, a short note to command staff. It was a sentence that will be copied into a file, taped into a dossier, and eventually handed to a widow who needed papers for a pension. Brandt, meanwhile, moved through days that blurred into one another. He learned the small religion of the prisoner's routine, when to wake, when the bread queue formed, how to keep your boots from cracking. He watched other men harden or soften depending on what news arrived. He read, in a handmade-down English newspaper, a paragraph about factories churning out aircraft engines and about pipelines that had been laid beneath the sea. He added those facts to the arithmetic that had already cost him and his comrades so much. The enemy could replace losses in ways his side could not. When liberation came for Brandt, it did so as an anticlimax. He left camp with only a thin hope and a pack with a small handful of items, the photograph he had kept, a watch that had survived the cold, and a wound in the calf that still ached when it rained. He found his way back to German territory through a system that, in the months after hostilities, moved thousands of men across lines and into the unknown. Letters were sent, names were checked, but somewhere between the time he registered his return and the official paper trail reached the offices responsible for correcting records, the date that affirmed his death had already been filed, and a life had begun moving on without him. That is the slow cruelty of record-keeping. Once a man is marked down, his absence becomes a fact to which other lives attune. A mother receives a pension. A fiancé, left with only a handful of clothes and a signature, changes plans and builds a fragile home. People make room for their grief, and in the doing, they create a new future where certain names do not appear at the dinner table. When the bureaucracy then realizes an error, the revelation is not simply administrative. It is an intrusion into a life that has been painstakingly rearranged. Brandt returned to a village where the butcher he remembered had died in the winter of 1945. The church door bore a new brass plate listing those from the town who had perished. His mother, a small, bent woman who had kept a tidy house and a stubborn store of hope, had been told her son had died. She had arranged, in the thin economies available to her, a small commemorative ritual, a note in the family Bible, a chair reserved at the table, a ribbon tied to the lace curtain in the best room. When Brandt came back, months later, and thin as winter itself, he found these gestures like traps. Recognition became a negotiation. He had to convince his mother that he was not a ghost, but her living son. She pressed both hands to his face and searched him for proof, for scars, for the weight of his shoulders. When she saw the photograph in the pocket he had kept, she held it to her chest and cried. But even that raw release could not undo the practical changes that had been made in the months when he was presumed gone. For others, the return was less welcome. A woman not only grieving, but remarried now, found herself with a man at the threshold who insisted on a place that had been given away. The small, private economies of survival, who to marry, where to live, how to manage a household with a ration card, do not yield to romantic narratives. The problem of the returned soldier is not only that he reappears, it is that life has moved and made choices that, while necessary, do not simply unwind at the sight of a familiar face. Brandt saw in the faces of neighbors both joy and an odd practical impatience. Their days had been rearranged without him. What changed him more than the domestic complications were the slow, grinding facts he had absorbed during captivity and travel home. That industrial production had already shifted the meaning of victory and loss. He would spend his evenings reading accounts of production figures and transport runs. He learned the scale of what had been moved across the channel, pipelines beneath the sea that the Allies used to push fuel eastward, millions of gallons, not in a single dramatic stroke, but in an unending, methodical flow. He learned that at Stavolo and Stavolo, enough gasoline had been burned to supply entire divisions for weeks. Those facts, casual and terrible together, pressed against the private puzzle of his life. Years passed. Brant worked odd jobs, helping rebuild barns, carrying bricks. He found a kind of stability and routine. Politics and memory remained fractious. The country he had served did not return to the world as it had been. It became instead a nation in pieces, occupied, reconstituting itself around bread and factories, shame and necessity. The kind of glory that had once seemed an answer to struggle had been exposed as an illusion by the arithmetic of resources. Men told stories in which the great deeds of arms had been overshadowed by the hum of a pipeline and the clatter of truck wheels. It was in that quieter landscape that the memory of the Ardennes settled into a private ache for Brant, not only for what had been lost, but for the strange indignity of being erased from records while still breathing. And then, years later, the moment the title promises and the human world demands, there was a knock at an ordinary wooden door. This scene is a dramatized composite vignette inspired by survivors' accounts and the realities of men returning from the war. The door stood set into a small house that had been patched a dozen times. Snow, when it visited, slid off the eaves in small wet curtains.
Inside, a woman in her late 30s, not Brant's original sweetheart, but a neighbor who had taken in his photographs during the period he was missing, stirred stew on a low flame and kept the radio tuned to a station that read news in dry voices. She had, over the years, grown used to the daily pattern of ordinary things: the milkman's creak, the neighbor's cough, the post that came at the same time each afternoon. When the knock came, it was 3 short, deliberate hits, not a scream or a shout. The sound itself seemed small against the house's habitual noises, but it carried a weight built from years of absence. The woman wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. The hallway smelled faintly of wood smoke and the stew she had left on the top of the stove. Her palms carried the warmth of domestic life, as if that warmth were an argument against the winter of memory. She opened the door to a man with a face that the years had flattened and ridged. He looked older than the photographs at home suggested he would. His haircut was a simple thing, his coat patched at the elbows, and there was a small line of frost along the collar of his sleeve. For a moment they only looked at one another, measuring the surprise, like 2 people checking the fit of a coat offered from a shelf. "Lucas," the neighbor said, because the photograph had had his name on the back, and because names hold lives in a way that other facts do not. He lifted his hand as if to prove the sound of his name was real. His voice was lower now, the edges worn by smoking, by a throat that had learned to swallow more than it had once spoken. "Yes," he said simply. Her knees went a little weak. The neighbor stepped back but did not close the door. It is a small thing to be given the chance to look at someone and know, with every absurd certainty, that a loss you had folded into your days has become a person again. The 2 of them stood in the narrow strip of winter light. Behind the man, down the lane, other figures emerged, some curious, some cautious, because small towns keep watch like ships with windows for eyes. They brought him inside. There were greetings, a cup of tin coffee that someone fumbled into being, and a table crowded with people who wanted to press a welcome into being, as if the action could fill all the empty years. Brant sat and explained, in fragments, how he had been at first captured, then moved, then misrecorded. He spoke with a practical tone that made what had happened sound like a bureaucrat's error rather than a cosmic betrayal. He spoke also, in shorter sentences, about the things that had not been wronged by documentation: the frost on a tank's treads, the smell of benzene in a barn, the sight of a depot burning to the sky. A child asked if he had been a hero. He smiled, not the broad grin the child expected, but a small one shaded by memory. "I survived," he said. "I came back." The room held the modest, complicated silence of ordinary people confronting a truth that could not be resolved by paperwork. The joy at his presence was real, and so was the awkwardness. The woman he had loved had remarried. His mother had confided trust to another set of hands. The household had been rebalanced by necessity. The return of one man could not unmake choices made under cold and hunger. There were quick apologies and slower adjustments. There were tears, and then a kind of practical tidying up of dishes and schedules. Life, which had learned to proceed without him, learned again to make room. But the knock at the door did more than fix a ledger. It forced conversation in a way that no official correction could. It made the neighbors speak of the winter that had scorched them. It made a man name the things he had seen and the decisions he had carried. For a few hours the talk returned to what had been, and the arithmetic of fuel and movement,
The pipelines and red ball convoys that had determined so much entered the kitchen as though trying on a voice of its own. Men and women spoke of how the Allies could burn their own stores with no fear because they knew they could replace them, while the other side had to ration at the level of households. The conversation never hardened into blame. It remained a mixture of astonishment and sorrow. There was, too, a question that hovered like steam over the coffee. What responsibility did the living have for a record that had been wrong? Brandt did not have a clean answer. The woman who had kept his photograph admitted to a small shame. She had, in the months he was missing, received a document that declared him dead and had accepted it because she could not live in perpetual hope. "We had to go on," she said. "It was the only way to feed the children." That honesty, the kind that named survival as a kind of necessity rather than a moral failing, was the most piercing thing in the room. The knock at the door exposed the brittle tricks a community uses to survive. It also, in a quieter way, demonstrated how systems, the pipeline, the convoys, the bureaucratic lists, make human life legible in ways that often miss the nuance of private loyalty and memory. After days of catching up, Brandt left town to find work. He kept in touch with those who had welcomed him. He visited his mother often. He found some measure of reconciliation with the life that had continued without him. But the memory of being declared dead lingered like a shadow, not because the mistake had been unique, such errors were common in the confusion of war, but because that designation had almost changed the shape of his life irrevocably. From the wider perspective, the Ardennes would be studied as a case in which logistics transcended traditional ideas of battlefield heroics.
Military historians wrote of the offensive as both a last gamble and a demonstration that industrial capacity had become the decisive factor in modern war. Planners who had once believed in decisive maneuver now had to reckon with the power of pipelines and production lines. The fact that the Allies could burn fuel to deny it to the Germans and yet continue their advance underscored a principle that could be stated flatly. The side that could produce, move, and replace resources at SKU dictated the tempo of war. But that truth, when translated into the language of a kitchen or a farmhouse, alters. For the men who stood around Brandt's table, it meant that decisions made in distant offices and workshops had echoes in the practicalities of life. Whether an ambulance reached a wounded man, whether a siege turned into starvation, whether a child's winter boots arrived in time. The industrialist's ledger and the neighbor's hearth were part of the same ecology. It is this friction between the macro and the micro that gives the Ardennes its moral difficulty. We must also name the darker facts without equivocation. Among the many tragedies of those cold weeks were crimes that cannot be softened by the language of logistics. The massacre at Malmedy, where American prisoners were murdered, stands as a stain that must be condemned in clear terms. Atrocities like that do not belong to any strategic calculus. They are moral crimes against those who, by choice or accident, fall into the hands of others. To speak of supply lines and pipelines in the same breath as such events is to remember that wars are made both of metal and of choices. The machinery of logistics does not excuse the brutality of men. In the years that followed, museums would display the instruments of war. A tiger in a glassed yard, its gun silent, a jerry can, dented and labeled, a woven map showing convoys like bloodlines. Visitors would stand before empty gauges and read plaques that explained how scarcity and abundance had shaped history. They would nod at numbers, gallons burned, tons moved, pipes laid across ocean beds. Those numbers are true and they matter. They clarify causality and provide a framework for understanding the sweep of events. Still, a gauge reading empty is not merely a number. Weeks of winter and a missing man's photograph are not an equation. The knock on the door years later shows this. It reminds us that the consequences of industrial decisions and strategic plans do not resolve themselves into neat historical judgments. They land in kitchens, in the lives of people who did not make the maps but who had to live under them. When historians say the war was won by industry, they are not praising a faceless mechanism. They are making a sober observation about causality. To say so is not to erase bravery in the field, but to insist that bravery is often insufficient in the face of overwhelming material advantage.
To acknowledge this is to honor both the engineers who laid pipelines and the odd men who warmed a comrade's hands over a small fire in a barn. Both are part of the ledger. Both deserve to be named. Lucas Brandt's life, after the knock at the door, became a small testament to that complexity. He lived long enough to watch the world rebuild around the engines that had once decided his fate. He kept the photograph in a drawer, creased at the edges, and once a year he visited the grave of an unnamed comrade who had been declared dead and never found. He sat sometimes before a silent tank in a museum and cupped his hands around the cold metal to remind himself that machines are merely tools and that their meaning depends on the choices people make. The final irony, perhaps the bitterest, is that those choices are often invisible until they present at a neighbor's threshold. A knock at a door is a simple thing. It is a sound that demands an answer and refuses to let the world settle into an unchallenged ledger. It can restore a man to his family, expose the compromises of the living, and force public systems to reckon with private truth. It cannot, however, fully repair the accumulations of winter, nor can it return the dead. It can, at best, make sure their absence is no longer counted as absolute by those who still remember them. So when you next see a photograph of a tank with a frozen gauge in an exhibit, or a museum plaque that lists tons moved through a pipeline, remember to imagine the small rooms and the wooden doors behind them. The story of the Ardennes is both mechanical and intimate. Pipelines and men, convoys and coffees shared over tiny fires. The knock at the door years later is a punctuation that insists we look at both. If this story moved you, and you want to learn more about how logistics shaped the outcomes of World War II, consider visiting a museum dedicated to the period, or reading works by historians who examine production and supply. Their books can expand the numbers you've heard here into a broader human picture. For more deep dive history stories like this one, subscribe and follow the channel. History ends in numbers and begins in the small acts by which people survive those numbers. The Ardennes showed the world that the ability to produce and move fuel was not a footnote but a chapter. The life of a man declared dead and returned by a knock at a simple door shows us in human scale what those chapters cost.